This morning, I'd like to look at John chapter 13, verses 12 through 17. And it says this: When he, being Jesus, had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." In this passage of Scripture, we find the culmination of what has actually been going on for a few days. On the way to Jerusalem, James and John's mother comes and asks Jesus for her sons, James and John, to have the right and left hand positions in Jesus' kingdom. So that would be like, the first and second in command in Jesus' kingdom. So the two most important positions in the kingdom that Jesus was going to establish. And the other disciples are upset. They're upset because they feel like somehow, number one, how could James and John's mom possibly have had the audacity to ask, for these two most important positions in Jesus' kingdom, and after all, it should have been them that has it instead. And so Jesus tries to deal with it right then and there on the way to Jerusalem. And then, like it is with a lot of times with our kids, when you have two kids that are bickering and arguing and you try to stop the argument, it just goes underground. It didn't really go away, it just went under the surface. When I was growing up, at our table at home, every one of us had a spot. Dad sat at the head of the table. My mom sat immediately to my mom's left, and then it was Chrissy and David, and then around the table was me and then Debbie. And that was our spot. I mean, that's where we sat. Now, I didn't realize until years later how that happened to be, but what happened was Dad sat at the head of the table, Mom sat to his left, and then the baby sat to Mom's left so that she could feed the baby. And then as the next baby came along, that one got bumped around the corner, and the next baby was close to Mom so that she could feed it. And so, as you went to our table, it went from oldest to youngest to Mom, and there was a reason for that. But we are people of habit. And I would submit to you that in the 3.5 years that the disciples had been with Jesus, that when they sat down and they ate, they had their places too. And that normally, I would say that we could probably infer from Scripture, normally, because at the Last Supper where we're at, when Jesus is doing this, John is to one side of Jesus, and I would say that Peter is probably normally to the other side of Jesus, and then they had their spots as they kind of went around the table from there. So normally I would imagine that probably Peter and John sat next to Jesus, and then, everybody had their spot. But as we come to this Last Supper, people aren't in their normal spots because they're still struggling with this, who's going to be greatest in Jesus' kingdom. When you were growing up and you were young and you came in from outside because Mom called you into supper, she wanted you to wash your hands before you sat down at the table. There were customs in Jesus' day too. They wore sandals, and they didn't have paved sidewalks and streets everywhere that they went. They were dusty roads. And so one of the customs in Jesus' day is that you washed your feet when you came in as a courtesy to whoever had the house and to the people that you were with. Just like we wash our hands before we eat at the table, one of their customs, in addition to the ceremonial washing of their hands, was the washing of their feet to get rid of the dust and the dirt and the grime. And that was usually performed by a household servant if you had one. In this particular case, there isn't one, right? It's just Jesus and the disciples that are there. And as they came in, the disciples apparently said to each other, I'm not going to wash their feet. They can wash my feet, right? I'm not the guy that's low on the totem pole. Somebody else can be that guy. And so as Jesus comes in my mind's eye, I picture him looking around and seeing that people are not sitting where they normally sit. And he looks at their feet and they're filthy and dirty. And he just is like, have you ever felt that way? It's like, I can't believe that we're doing this again. Because this whole thing that started on the road to Jerusalem over a week ago, is still festering under the surface. And so Jesus takes the basin and the towel and he begins to wash the disciples' feet. Something that should have already been done. And I imagine that as he kneels down and he begins to wash the feet of each of the disciples, that they begin to feel really super guilty and just basically pretty horrible. And Jesus gets to Peter and Peter says, "No, Lord." And Jesus says, "I need to do this." And when he gets done, he says to them, do as I've done for you. You see, Jesus could have hollered and yelled and said, "I can't believe that you guys are still fighting over this." But he didn't do that. Instead of getting angry, instead of shoulding them, saying you should be doing this or you shouldn't be doing that, he simply, quietly did what they should have already done. And I think that was probably something that the disciples carried with them for the rest of their life. Today, the term servant leadership sounds more like an oxymoron than something that we should pursue. However, this is what Jesus is calling us to do. This morning, I'd like to point out 3 characteristics of servant leadership. And the first is this: a good servant leader leads by example. A good servant leader leads by example. In John 13:15, it says this: "I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done for you." I've given you an example to follow. Do as I have done for you. We can look at Jesus' life, we can look at Jesus' ministry, and we can find several things that he didn't have to do, but he did. And I believe that the reason that he did them is because he will never ask us to do what he himself was unwilling to do. One of those, I think, was his baptism. Today, we baptize people for the forgiveness of their sins, right? When we baptize them, they are buried with Christ in baptism and raised to walk in the newness of life. When they're baptized, we would say that the blood of Jesus covers their sins and they rise up as a new creature in Jesus. Did Jesus need to be baptized for the forgiveness of his sins? No. The Bible says that Jesus never sinned. And yet, he was baptized, even though we don't have any recording of the disciples being baptized. And I believe that the reason was exactly what I told you. Remember, when Jesus comes to John and says, I want you to baptize me. John says, you should be baptized. You should be baptizing me instead. And Jesus said, I need to do this in order to fulfill all righteousness. He didn't say, I need to do this to have my sins forgiven. He said, I need to do this to fulfill all righteousness. But I believe the reason that he did it was because he'll never ask us to do something that he himself was unwilling to do. He knew that he would ask us to be baptized, and so he set the example for us. Jesus, in John 13, shows us that he wants us to serve other people, and so he showed us by his example of washing the disciples' feet. I remember when I was young, about 1 billion years ago, when I finished my freshman year of college, I spent the summer traveling with the college on a summer camp team. And we went from one church camp to the next church camp to the next church camp. We got back on Friday, washed our clothes, went back out on Sunday, to the next camp. And I can remember that in those very early days, when it was lights out time, I was, and I don't say this to my credit, okay? This is not good. And it shows the immaturity that I had at that time. I was the lights out Gestapo. And I was the guy that was walking up and down the aisles, and you need to be quiet, and you need to go to sleep, and if you don't, we're going to have to clean the toilets with your toothbrush or something. And we're going to, or take away swim privileges. We're going to do something, but you've got to, and as I have gotten older, thankfully, I'm not as uptight as I used to be. And I think that comes with maturity. Right? I mean, maybe when you were younger and the first time that mom and dad left you in charge of your siblings, it's like, finally, I'm in charge. I'm the boss, right? And we want to order those people that are underneath us around. But that's not true servant leadership, is it? We don't really respect the guy that tells us to do all the stuff he doesn't want to do. We respect the guy who's willing to climb into the yucky stuff with us and work right along beside us. When right before I came here to minister to the Alburnett Christian Church, I managed a Pentecost Auto Center. And I did my training in Urbandale, Iowa, under a guy by the name of John. And he was also, not only was he the manager in charge of the store there at Urbandale, the Pentecost Auto Center in Urbandale, but he also ended up becoming my district manager. And I had a tremendous amount of respect for him because he was always willing to do right there with us everything that needed to be done. He was the guy, you've seen guys that are in charge that when they get in trouble, it's not my fault, it's the guys underneath me That was not John. You know, even if it was our fault, John took responsibility for it. And then he encouraged us to do better. He brought out the best in us, and he made us want to be better managers, better employees. And as Christian people, that's the kind of leadership that Christ is calling us to have as well. The kind of leader who gets right into the trenches along with everybody else and is willing to do the exact same things that the people he leads are doing. Because those are the kind of people that we respect. Secondly, a good servant leader does not lord over his followers. A good servant leader does not lord over his followers. In Matthew 20, 25 through 26, it says this, "But Jesus called them together and said, 'You know that in this world kings are tyrants, and officials lord it over the people beneath them. But among you, it should be quite different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant.'" Wouldn't it be wonderful if the people that are supposed to represent us in Washington actually did what Jesus talks about here in Matthew? Wouldn't it be really wonderful if they actually led by their example and the things that they do? But what's unfortunate is that many times the rules that they make for us don't apply to them in Washington. You know, Martha Stewart went to jail for insider trading, right? I mean, it's been quite a long time ago, right? But it's legal for people in the House and Senate to engage in insider trading. So it's legal for them to do what they sent Martha Stewart to jail for. Because there's rules for us, and then there's different rules for them. So you see, Jesus said, in my kingdom, in my church, it's not that way. It's not to be that way. You're not to lord over those who are underneath you. You're not to have a I'm the boss, you're the sauce kind of mentality as an elder or as a minister. You know, I think a part of that comes from actually loving and caring for the people that you're responsible for. If you truly love and care for the people that you are responsible for, you will take care of them. You know, I think about moms who take care of their sick kids, who are sometimes so tired, you know, that they just can barely hold their eyes open, but they still get up to make sure that they get their, you know, their aspirin or their Tylenol to make sure that the fever doesn't get out of control, and they're there to make sure that they, you know, have bland foods to eat and take, you know, meet their needs. You see, that's the kind of leadership that Christ wants in his church. Not leaders who are going to lord it over those people that are underneath them. Do it my way or else. Instead, it's leaders who love and care about those people that they are responsible for and would do anything that was necessary to protect them and to care for them. Now, does that mean that we don't ever do anything that's uncomfortable? No. When you think back to raising your kids, you had them do things that were uncomfortable for them, but you did them because you wanted what was best for them. I think as we look at our society today, we have a lot of people that have not been disciplined in the way that they were brought up, and we're seeing the consequence of that in our society today. And so a good leader, strives to help his people that are underneath him be the very best that they can possibly be. That doesn't mean that it's always, fun and games and never any difficult times. But a good leader loves and cares for the people that's underneath him. And then finally, a good servant leader grows leaders like himself. A good servant leader grows leaders like himself. So a good servant leader leads by example. A good servant leader does not lord over his followers. And a good servant leader grows leaders like himself. In Acts 14:13, it says this: the Jewish leaders saw that Peter and John were not afraid to speak. And they understood that these men had no special training or education. So they were amazed. Then they realized that Peter and John had been with Jesus. You see, Peter and John were simple fishermen. Jesus called them and said, you know what? I'm going to change your occupation. You're no longer just going to be fishermen. You're going to fish for men. And so Jesus spent the next 3.5 years not just training these 12 guys, but living with them. He lived with them. He ate with them. I'm sure that there are times that because I'm sure that there are times that Jesus just went like, I can't believe that they haven't got it yet. Because he would try to teach them something, and then they would turn right around and they'd be right back where they were at. And he's like, and I just know in my mind that there are times like he said, oh, right? Maybe that's why he spent so much time in prayer. Because of the frustration of, trying to, train these guys. Today, leaders, a lot of times, they only care about those people that are underneath them during the 8 hours that they see them at work. Jesus wasn't that way. He ate with them. He slept with them. He lived with them. He, modeled what he wanted them to be. And then when Jesus was gone, after he had been crucified and raised from the dead and had appeared to the disciples and to others off and on for the next 40 days and ascended to heaven, and Peter preaches the very first gospel message at Pentecost, and 3,000 people come and are saved and start the church. That's a great Sunday, right? 3,000 conversions in one Sunday, man, that's awesome. Okay, but and they begin to preach about Jesus, and the religious leaders, they drag them into the Sanhedrin. And it says there in Acts that they are astonished because these guys are uneducated men. They're simple common folk. They haven't had the education that the Apostle Paul had, where he studied at the feet of Gamaliel. They're just normal, everyday, ordinary folk. And yet, the message that they proclaimed was powerful. And then they understood that these guys had been with Jesus. You see, a good leader grows the people that are around him up to be like him. Jesus says, Paul says, the Apostle Paul says, follow my example, even as I am following the example of Jesus Christ. That takes a tremendous amount of responsibility, doesn't it? That means that I'm going to invest a lot of time and energy to make sure that my relationship with Jesus is right so that I'm not leading other people astray. In order for me to be able to say, if you want to know what a living, breathing example of Jesus is, look at me. Even as I am following his example. That's a pretty tall order, isn't it? But that's what the Apostle Paul says. And that should be what we strive to attain too. Because, they're honest. And whether you are an elder or a deacon or just somebody who comes to church and sits in the pew, the honest truth and the reality is this, is that God intends to judge the world by you. He intends to judge the world by you. What do I mean by that? Well, let's be honest. Most of us don't spend as much time in this book as we know we should. And if we as God's people, if we as Christian people don't spend as much time in here as we probably ought to, how much time do you think the average non-Christian spends in this book? Yeah, probably none. Right? I mean, if we're honest. And so their idea of what Christianity is, if it's not based off of this book, is based off of what? What they see in people who claim to be Christians. Right? So they are making their assumption of what Christianity is or isn't and how worthwhile Christianity is by looking at people who claim to be Christians and saying, you know what, that's something that I want for myself. Or man, I don't see any difference. God's intention is for him to be able to judge the world by the lives that his people lead, so that when they stand in judgment, God can say to them, you knew exactly what I expected because you saw my people. You saw Dale at work when he worked at St. Luke's. And even when he could be sitting around doing nothing, he still continued to work. You saw, Dave when he worked at PMX, and he told the truth even when it would have been easy for him to lie. You see, God intends for his people to live deliberately in such a way that when non-Christian people stand before him, they will be without excuse. So not only does God expect his people who lead his church to be servant leaders, but he expects all of his people, in a sense, to lead by the example that they live. By the example that they set. Now, are we always going to do it right? Nope. We're not, because we're human. And that's why the goal is to always focus people's attention on Jesus. Jesus, if they have their focus on Jesus, they will never be disappointed. If they focus on Dan Peterson, they're going to be disappointed because Dan makes mistakes. And that should always be our goal, is to focus the attention on Jesus Christ. But the reality is this: for many people, and people that we don't even necessarily even know, they are judging Christianity by the way that we live our life. There's a lot of people who know me that I don't know. Because I preach in the pulpit, I drive school bus, I go to, I respond with the volunteer fire department on occasion. There's people that know of me and know who I am that I have no idea who they are. And because they know that I am a minister, they are judging Christianity by the way that I live my life. That's a huge responsibility. But it's also a tremendous privilege. because I get to represent the creator and the sustainer of the universe. I mean, that's way better than anybody who's ever run for president, right? That's better than any king or queen who's ever sat on a throne. I get to represent the person who made it all. And if I'm faithful, one day that person will say to me, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." And at that moment, it'll all be worth it. It'll all be worth it. No matter what the price was that I had to pay, it will all be worth it.